So, Gillian, do you predict that someday we'll have the Council of Anthropological Advisors as a department within the White House in the United States and its equivalent around the world?
I wouldn't expect that, to be honest. I think that would make anthropologists themselves uncomfortable. But what I'm really arguing is that you should look at anthropology as being like salt added into food, in that it brings out the flavor and it helps ingredients bind together. Or to use another metaphor, using economic models and analysis is incredibly useful. It's like using a compass to walk through a dark wood at night. You need to know what direction you're going in, and if you have a great compass, you don't throw it out. But if you try and walk through a wood just looking down at the dial of the compass, then you're likely to walk into a tree or trip over a tree root. And what anthropology does, its real power, is provide a sense of context and allows you to get lateral vision, to look up from your dial and look around in a way that helps to avoid accidents and helps to put things into a wider common sense vision. And economics desperately needs that right now, because we are at a point where it's become clear that narrow macroeconomic models which assume that the future will be like the past simply don't work.
You have a segment in the book where you talk about how anthropologists have studied, I guess it was actually an artist that from Russia had you alluded to, and they talked about a chart that was put up at the Museum of Modern Art related to the Amazon Echo, which is the voice we know as Alexa, and how this illuminated what was happening in the process of creating this AI-like network. And so-called ghost workers were represented in this art. You suggested that this kind of broadening of awareness will help us and help Amazon executives to understand the true costs and benefits of the process that they're embarked upon. I'm wondering, do you think that anthropologists will become part of the C-suite in corporations?
Well, Rob, you point out a great issue here, which is that in many ways, when you move from taking a tunnel vision approach to looking at the world to making more of a lateral vision, looking at the social and cultural context of economies and businesses and any type of economic activity, you start to get a vision of the world that's incredibly similar to the type of vision being proposed these days by the stakeholderism movement or sustainability movement or the environmental, social and governance movement, to use that very ugly acronym. Or to put it another way, you start to see all the things that used to be considered as externalities in economic models, like environment or the wider community, they start to get noticed. And I think in many ways, the fact we're seeing so many companies and executives and financiers now embracing ESG and sustainability is a sign that people almost instinctively recognize that we need lateral vision today, not tunnel vision, and a sense of context. And I do think that you're seeing corporate boards increasingly trying to use all kinds of mechanisms to get that sense of context, to get those checks and balances, to try and step out of themselves a bit, to see how other people might view them and try to respond accordingly, and just be aware that if they exist in ivory towers or ghettos, they're likely to be running risks. So will companies hire anthropologists? Well, yes, some have already, quite a lot have already done so in order to study their own customers, to work out how to better, serve them. Because the reality is that customers often don't have the same mindset as people who are trying to sell them things think they do. Some companies are hiring anthropologists to look inside themselves and see their own structures. But I think going forward there will be an attempt to harness anthropology to look at the wider context in which companies sit and how they can avoid either creating risks as a result of that or find new opportunities.
In the realm of education, you're suggesting that there's a broader type of education that is necessary to add value in this dimension. Should our schools be training citizens rather than input to production and defamiliarizing people, or at least inoculating their hearts from the fears that they will be left behind in the realm of commerce?
Well, Rob, you raised such an important issue there, which I think is going to be cutting the core of everyone who's a parent, as I am with two daughters. Because the reality is that most kids entering schools today feel like they're entering an arms race, where they have to scramble breathlessly to get as many grades, qualifications, chips on the counter that will get them onto the next stage of the conveyor belt, often in a very, very narrow channel and narrow path. And in many ways, it's terrifying because we're creating people who are assuming that there's only really one path to follow. And the reality is, we're in such an uncertain world that the very opposite is true. I was lucky enough to have my own education in a time when actually there wasn't a lot of academic pressure on me or other kids my age. We worked, but we also had a chance to roam and collide with the unexpected. And I roamed a lot as a teenager. I roamed physically around where I lived. I roamed across Europe in various ways. And then when I went into college, I roamed intellectually between different disciplines. I roamed into different countries. I roamed all over the place in a very, very undirected way. That enriched me enormously and is one of the key reasons I became an anthropologist. This idea of jumping out of yourself and trying to explore the other. But I do worry that kids today just don't have either the ability or the courage to do that, which means actually their parents don't have the courage to let them do that. And if nothing else, once the pandemic ends, I desperately hope that we all start sending our kids around the world physically for exchange programs, for travel periods, for study programs, or just for travel, to just widen their mind.
You talked at one point in the book about we're creatures of the environment and the cultural scene, the social scene. There's no single cultural frame. We have to immerse ourselves in the minds and lives of others, developing empathy. Look at the world with the lens of an outsider or of the other, and use the perspective to listen for the social silences. That sounded to me like curriculum reform of the first grade. Those 5 pieces, boy, I said, I got to figure out how to build the next economics textbook around those 5 principles.
Well, I think you've raised a great point there, and I think that kind of is curriculum reform. If you want to boil it down, it could be encapsulated by the words "go roam, go listen, go learn," and that is something which is terribly important for us to do inside schools or higher education places. But frankly, it's terribly important for anybody who's a professional specialist to do, because what happens, whatever education you've had as a child or student, is when you get into the workplace, you increasingly get affirmed into whatever specialist discipline you're in. And you tend to climb the corporate hierarchy or the university hierarchy by doubling down on that specialism. And you inevitably start creating pretty rigid boundaries around your world. And those boundaries can be fantastic. The discipline you're an expert in might be absolutely brilliant. But as human beings, we tend to create taxonomies and silos that reflected the world that existed 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And when the world outside changes, we keep defending our boundaries or the walls of our particular silo and don't realize how it's changing and how we're basically losing out on innovative ideas or at risk of missing big dangers. So frankly, we need to roam whether we are 6 years old or 60 years old and have the courage and time to do that.
I remember a very clever woman who was a friend of mine wrote a book called The Silo Effect.
Well, that was indeed my last. That was my last book. In many ways, the new book is a kind of extension of the last book. The last book said there's a huge problem because we are all beset with silos, and they're very damaging, and they cause bright people to do really stupid things. This book really says, well, actually, if you want to try and deal with the problem of the silos and build a better world, this is one way to do it. Learn some lessons from cultural anthropology.
You talked about in the book how non-financiers view finance as a means, and that there is, particularly after 2008, a tremendous upsurge in moral outrage because of the way in which financiers view something which you might call not through the lens of others, almost like they're playing a video game.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Rob, and I think that the fact the financial crisis really gave birth to INET is no accident, because firstly it was a traumatic crisis which forced everyone to rethink their attitudes towards economics and finance, but it also underscored this sense of detachment that you're talking about in terms of how many financiers were thinking, and INET was really created to try and reroute economics and finance back in the political economy and society, if you like. And there's a wonderful Spanish anthropologist, financial anthropologist called Daniel Beunza, who teaches at the SCAS School of Business in London, who uses the phrase model-based moral disengagement, and this idea that financiers or economists, armed with their models, can become so caught up with peering at their model that they fail to see the consequences of what the model actually means in the real lives of people, or the context in which those models are operating. I mean, to go back to the analogy I used about a compass in a wood at night, people are walking around peering at their compass in the dark and not noticing that they're about to trip over a tree root, or not noticing, in a better example, people are walking around and not noticing they're causing other people to trip over tree roots. And so that's really a crucial element of where I think finance and economics needs to widen the lens right now in terms of understanding the implications of what they're doing. And that's so true of the tech sector as well. I mean, the tech sector is a classic area which has also succumbed to tunnel vision in recent years. And there needs to be an awareness of context and consequence there as well.
I remember Bill Janeway, one of our fellow board members at INET, talking to me about how he thought it was such an anomaly that so many people on Silicon Valley were extreme libertarians. Adam Curtis said they named their children Ein or Rand based on a girl or a boy. And what Bill's concern was the U.S. government was very important in the transformation to this tech world, this internet world, that places like DARPA and the NSA and so forth were the seed corn. Government was essential to the transformation, which was taken over brilliantly by the private sector. But now they act like they don't need them. And as we approach climate change, it does seem like Seth Klein, Naomi's older brother, has said, we got to have the good war. The good war is the preparation for climate change modeled on war preparation, because we don't have a choice not to address these dilemmas. But this is a very different consciousness. This would involve, whether it's Janeway or Seth Klein or you or I, accepting a role for governance again.
Well, I think that actually there is increasing acceptance of that anyway, quite frankly. And I think that what's happened with the race for the vaccine is you saw a level of public-private cooperation and cooperation between companies that frankly you've not seen for a very long time. And no, that hasn't changed everything. And yes, it's amazing how quickly people can forget lessons from the past. But the reality is you've laid down a different set of tram tracks in terms of how people imagine operating in terms of government and companies right now. And I suspect that in the coming years we're going to see that rear its head more and more.
I think somebody said, going back to economics texts, the days of externalities being a footnote in chapter 37 are over. But the next edition really has to explore the scope and the scale of what Muhammad Ali's famous poem, Me, We, the pendulum is swinging towards we and away from me.
Well, I think it's not just a question of economics having to look at the externalities in the models. I think it's also the fact that companies need to look at what used to be sitting in the footnotes of their balance sheets. So you'd have a footnote of the balance sheet, or you'd have a separate, CSR, corporate social responsibility report talking about things like the environment. And in today's world, that basically is a large part of the model, or a large part of the balance sheet.
And there's probably an interesting anthropology of the insurance industry to be written, because the actuarial tables depend upon past being prologue. And that
one of the key arguments in the book is that, so many of our big data sets, which I'm saying can be amazingly useful, are drawn on data that's gathered in the present or the recent past. And so many of the economic models are basically constructed presuming that the past is a good guide to the future. And the answer is it often is. I'm not in any way meaning to undermine the usefulness of a lot of these models, But the reality is that if you don't look at the context, when the context around these models is changing fast, which it has been in the last decade, then that's when you can no longer assume that the present or recent past is such a perfect guide to the future. Or to use another point that economists often make when they're looking at statistical data, correlation is not causation. You can see all kinds of clever correlations and presume that they're going to last forever, but they're not causation. So if you have big data or AI sets, models, platforms based around that, they may not be as perfect as you think.
What are the ingredients to this Anthro-Vision type of education that prepares people to be a credible and successful leader in this very complex society?
Well, I lay it out in 3 parts of my book, and this really is a guiding principle for me. The first principle is to make the strange familiar, and by that I mean to go somewhere different from yourself and really try to immerse yourself into that mindset. And you can do that by physically traveling somewhere else. You can do that by mentally traveling, by reading different things, by getting out of your own cyber ghetto, whichever cyber ghetto you're in on social media, or whatever ghetto you're in terms of your own media consumption. You can also do it inside institutions, and one of the benefits of having a diverse team inside institutions, or diversity inside institutions, is to try and make the strange familiar and to get exposed to different mindsets and points of view. So the first point really is to try and embrace every opportunity you can get to make the strange familiar, and then use that to make the familiar strange, to look back at yourself and say, how am I weird? How am I dysfunctional? What am I not seeing? And then to look at the social silences and to think, okay, I'm in education, maybe I'm an economics student, I'm getting this wonderful training in economics. What am I not studying? Am I surrounded entirely by people who think like me? How relevant is it to my world? And to give you one tiny example, I dare say many economic students today will be sitting inside university halls of residence and looking at, say, inequality or labour market issues and thinking lots of great thoughts about that. Have you ever stopped and thought about the nature and state of the janitors in your own university building and what that might or might not reveal about inequality? One anthropologist actually did that and went around and did her research project studying the janitors in the university buildings. She was forced to do it because she ran out of money to go anywhere else, but then realized that out of necessity comes enormous opportunity, because literally hidden in plain sight was this entire community she'd never even paid any attention to before, never spoken to, never listened to, never learnt from. And frankly, a group like that can probably teach your average economist as much, if not more, about inequality and labour market economics as all the other models that they might be learning in their classroom. And it doesn't mean that one displaces the other, but they're most powerful when combined in tandem.
I recently read a book by a gentleman who goes by the name Patrick Lawrence, and he writes a lot about foreign policy. My focus was the United States versus China. In this book, which I think he wrote in about 2011 or 2013, in that window of time, it's called Somebody Else's Century. And it was about that the Americans come from this Western Cartesian Enlightenment framework, and that a whole lot of, we'll call Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, and Eastern philosophy is a very different way of looking at the world and deciding what is meaning. Obviously, I'm not running a race between the two, but with a thing like the G20, the two sit at the same table now, and they have to negotiate with each other without projecting their own philosophical framework into the mind of the person across the table from a different part of the world. How can we build those bridges when what you might call dangers of distrust in light of climate are very profound?
Well, that's a very important question, because certainly at the moment we are dealing at a time of great distrust, and it can't be done with a magic wand overnight. You do need to quietly and patiently try to listen. But it's worth going back to a core point, which is very important these days, and every institution needs to think about, which is, what is the basis of trust? how do we actually create trust which acts as a social glue for any group? And anthropologists used to say there were two distinct axes of trust or ways to create trust. You can have vertical trust, which is basically trust in a leader or institution, and that works best with large groups of people. Or you have horizontal trust, which is basically peer-to-peer trust in tiny groups, i.e. I trust you because we all know each other. We're a club, we're a family, we're a village, we're a class, we've kind of all grown up together, I can eyeball you. So you had horizontal trust or vertical trust. What you have today is what they call distributed trust as well, which is really what happens on digital platforms when lots and lots of people put their faith in the ability to check each other out and have some kind of checks and balances through digital platforms. That's how Uber works, that's how Airbnb works, for example. It's also in some ways how something like Bitcoin works. So if you're thinking about building trust, it's important to recognize that you can do that on those different axes and then ask, well, okay, people say today that trust in institutions has collapsed. Well, it has collapsed according to the surveys, but actually distributed trust is quite high, and there are mechanisms that you can do to actually build that trust. Radical transparency online is helping to build a lot more trust. Conversations are building more trust. So it's not necessarily a brute either or. There are different ways to adapt to the world today.
Have economists lost credibility? Not because they did something personally unethical, but because their vision is inadequate to the challenge?
I think that economists at the moment are seeing their role and place change within the government. In that, for the last 2 decades, you've had a very distinctive tribe of economists who are often wedded to macroeconomic models, having tremendous power and influence. I used to joke that this was the Bob Rubin tribe, where basically you had a distinctive school academic network who were very influential. And then you had, of course, the Donald Trump era, where there didn't appear to be much interest in using experts of any sort. And what's happened with the Biden team is that they have brought on board economists, but not your usual economists. They are increasingly turning to labor market economists, microeconomists, people who frankly are questioning the boundaries of economics in a way that I would embrace in my book. And that has understandably caused a lot of consternation amongst many of the parts of the discipline. In fact, some people have said to me there's almost a kind of tribal warfare going on, a tribal ousting going on between the different sides. And some people are very critical of what the Biden team's doing, precisely because they appear to be veering away from the use of economics and economists. But another way to see it is basically they're widening the lens and trying to bring on board a more social appreciation of economics and look at things like labor market issues or climate issues, which were once again those externalities before.
What? Let's talk about you yourself. What most concerns you now? Let's say for the legacy that we're handing to our children. What do you see as most intractable, and what would you? Through the Anthro-Vision, how do we address that challenge?
Well, the legacy that's most immediate, obviously, is climate change. That is a serious legacy, which is requiring serious action, and it's unclear whether we're going to have the will to actually take the action we need to protect and preserve the planet. But aside from that, the question of inequality, because COVID-19 has really exacerbated inequalities in a very cruel way. And when coupled with the extraordinary tech transformation, we could be sliding towards a world that's increasingly unequal, where the younger generation feels they don't have much of a stake in preserving social harmony and stability, where they essentially feel like they're screwed. And that will be a recipe for growing tension and conflict. So, I'm very concerned about the future right now. I hope that one lesson we'll learn from the pandemic is for economic reset and a mental reset. And we try and move towards a more collaborative world, embrace what I call Anthro-Vision. But if we don't, then I think the future is pretty dark. It's worth remembering that, after you had the pandemic, you had the Roaring Twenties. Everyone thought, great, wonderful, back to normal. You had a stock market boom, dramatic stock market boom that then went bust. And then that, of course, ushered in a Great Depression and then war. And it's not impossible to see the kind of patterns we're seeing play out right now, leading towards a lot more conflict in the future. But I'd also say, just to be a bit more cheerful, I'd make 2 points. Firstly, the vaccine scramble, was initially very depressing, but actually ended up being not so depressing because you did get collaboration between companies and governments and companies around the world. People used the magical power of the internet to connect us all, to swap ideas scientifically at a speed we've never seen before. Yes, there are fights about patents and production. Yes, there is extreme gross inequity between the way that different countries are getting access to vaccines and the other ones are not. And yet even there, the fact you can use digital transparency today to illuminate these kinds of inequities is also creating political pressure for more distribution and more change. So I wouldn't be so despairing, and I'd also point out that actually the fact that companies and policy leaders and even economists and others are embracing sustainability and ESG again is a sign of people trying to take a more lateral vision and a wider, dare I say it, Anthro-Vision approach to life.
I look at all of this tension and this distress, and I look at someone at a perch like the Financial Times, who influences many of the people who had the kind of consciousness that you've criticized in their formative years or what have you, and yet you can reach them, and you're not afraid of them. You become a guiding light. You illuminate the possibilities. And I often, as you know, think in terms of music. And the song that came to mind as I was reading your book and as I listened to you is by Van Morrison, and it's called "The Healing Has Begun."
Oh, thank you. That's incredibly kind of you. And let's hope that the optimistic scenario is one that's going to play out, and that the vaccine search will be a good metaphor for both the terrible problems besetting our world, but also the fact that sometimes people can try to find solutions and make progress.
Yes.